All right, so now we want to look at the impact on demand and supply when a government is imposing a tax on a product or giving a subsidy for a product. So we'll start on the supply side. So what we're looking at here is the government is going to impose a tax to be collected by the sellers, okay? One of the things we're going to see as we go through these concepts today is the collection of the tax is just set up by the government. So they say the sellers will collect it or the buyers will collect it. That's the person who's physically gathering the money and sending it in. But that's not the same thing as who pays the tax. We're going to be looking at a 60-cent tax, and the sellers would love to pass the full tax on to the buyers, but because the demand is downward sloping, because the supply is upward sloping, you don't pass on the whole tax, you just pass on as much as you can. So there's the who pays the tax, which is how much of the 60 cents is paid by the sellers, how much is paid by the buyers. It could be 30 cents, 30 cents, it could be 20, 40, 10, 50, it could be anything. So we're going to start with the idea that the sellers are collecting the tax, but when we put the supply with the demand, we'll see how it shakes out on how much of the tax is paid for by the sellers and how much is paid for by the buyers. All right, so here we have our supply curve for some gasoline. We're going to say that there is a $3 market price. If we had our demand curve drawn in here, we'd see that that would be the market price. You'll just have to take my word for it. So that'll be $3, and we'll say that 400 million gallons of gasoline will be sold at $3, okay? Now, the amount of the tax is going to be the 60 cents. So what will that do to the supply curve? Well, what we have to remember is, what does that mean that they were willing to sell 400 million gallons at $3? They still associate $3 with 400 million, even with the tax. They can't just suddenly be willing to supply 400 million and not get $3 and get something less than $3. So what they need is, they need this 400 million to now be associated with a price 60 cents higher, okay? Oh, come on. This is supposed to be 360. So the supply curve will shift up by the amount of the tax, directly vertical shift. So the distance from this point, let's get this going. The distance from this point to this point is the amount of the tax, which in this case is 60 cents. So this point on the supply curve needs to be shifted up to a new supply curve, including the tax, and it'll be the amount of 60 cents. So the entire supply curve shifts up in a vertical direction equal to the amount of the tax. So that's the first thing you want to get going here. Now the demand curve, when we bring it in, would be flowing through here. And so one of the reasons that I'm saying that the full 60 cents is not borne by just the sellers or just the buyers is both curves have a slope to them. They're not vertical. So that gives us an idea of what's happening on the supply side when the government imposes a tax to be collected by the sellers. Let's look what happens to the demand side when it is the buyers that are being told to collect and pay for the tax. All right, so here we are looking at the demand curve for this market for gasoline. We see again the market price, no tax, is $3 and 400 million gallons of gasoline. And so we have to think about if the buyers are now being told that they have to pay a 60-cent tax. And by that I mean they're responsible for sending in 60 cents to the government for every gallon they buy. What would that do to this market? We saw with the supply side that the supply curve shifted up, but that doesn't necessarily make sense here. We need to think about what does it mean when we say that they associate 400 million gallons with $3? That means that to get them to buy 400 million, they're going to be all in at $3. That's if you make them pay $3.60, 360 is going to be associated with the quantity demanded up here, right? Because 360 would be somewhere around here. There's your quantity demanded. So you're not going to be shifting the demand curve up. So instead, with the demand side, they need to be paying $3 completely out of pocket in order to get them to do 400 million gallons. So that means it needs to be $3 including the tax, and then $3 including the tax would result in a price of $2.40. So instead of what we saw on the demand side with the on the supply side, excuse me, on the demand side, we're going to see that the demand curve shifts down by the amount of the tax. So we need to put our 240 here, and that'll be that point. And then the demand curve at this point would shift down 60 cents. This point would shift down 60 cents. And so you end up with a demand with the tax being down the vertical distance of the tax. So the vertical distance of anywhere on this demand curve down to that one is the 60 cents. All right, so now we have our two graphs side by side. The sellers are going to be collecting the tax on the left-hand side, and the buyers are the ones being taxed on the right-hand side. But what I want you to get from this is it doesn't really matter who is collecting the tax. It's going to be shared the same in both scenarios. And the reason I think this is important to understand is in the real world, you'll hear politicians talk about how they're going to put a tax on business, for example, and the implication is you, the consumer, aren't being taxed. It's just those businesses, they're the ones that are being taxed. And so hopefully what you'll see after we make it through this lesson today is actually everybody is paying the tax. And what determines the burden of the tax, what percentage you pay as a consumer, what percent the businesses pay, has more to do with the shape of the demand and supply curve. It does not have anything to do with who is being told to collect and send in the tax. So let's take what we've learned for the left-hand side, and we are going to put a 60-cent tax on this graph. We know that means the supply curve needs to shift up 60 cents directly vertical. So we need to go up 60 cents everywhere along here. So that would end up looking something like this. And we know that at this point here, this is our $3 point originally on the supply curve. This point here, directly vertical, would be the 360. So 360 is now going to be up here. However, we have our supply curve shifting up, but it moves along the demand curve. We don't just move directly up here and we now have a market price of 360 to keep this equilibrium 400, because since you're moving along a demand curve and the price is rising, you're going to see that decrease in the quantity demanded. So some of the new equilibrium quantity is going to be a lower quantity, and it's not going to be a full price of 360. It's going to be something between $3 and 360. So let's just say that this price here is 340, okay? All right, so original price in the market, $3. After tax price is 340, but the tax was 60 cents. So what's going to happen then is this is now where we're existing, is the new supply. Well, this looks a little misleading here. S1 goes to the bottom one, and this one is the S-tax supply curve. So we got our 340 here, and we know that when we look down to this original supply curve, it's going to be a 60-cent drop. There is a 60-cent distance between these two. So let's get that labeled. 340 there, and that would be 340 minus 60 cents, so that's going to be 280. So what's the significance of that? Well, what's happening is the demand and the supply interact. They determine this market price of 340. The sellers collect 340 at the point of payment. So from the buyer's point of view, the price has risen 40 cents, right? It used to pay 3. Now they pay $3.40. But from the seller's point of view, they collect $3.40 and then mail in 60 cents to the government. Okay, so they're actually only getting $2.80 when all is said and done. Even though they're collecting $3.40, they're only going to get to keep $2.80. And there's your 60 cents. They collect $3.40. 40 cents of the 60 cents comes from the buyers paying 40 cents more. And 20 cents of the 60-cent tax comes from sellers receiving less. Okay? So let's look over on the buyer's side what was happening. What we learned over here was that when you put a 60-cent tax on the buyers, they're still only going to be willing to pay $3 for 400 gallons with the tax included. So the demand curve will actually drop the 60 cents. And this would be demand tax. There we go. And so what we know then is if this was our original equilibrium point, this vertical drop down here would be 240. That's your full 60 cent drop. So that would be about there. All right. But again, this is not where we're going to end up, because when the demand falls, we move down along the supply curve. And so we're actually going to end up here. So on the demand side then, we are going to find our equilibrium, obviously here, where the two cross. But as far as the buyers are concerned, this is the price they pay at the pump, and then they have to hand over 60 cents to the government. So this distance is going to be 60 cents from the new equilibrium to here, and that's going to be the same price that we see over here of $3.40 and $2.80. That's obviously 60 cents apart, and that's what's going to work out as our new equilibrium. So the price that the sellers receive is $2.80, and then the price that the buyers pay is $2.80 to the sellers plus 60 cents to the government, which is the $3.40. And so in both cases then, we're going to end up where it does not matter who is collecting the tax. What matters is simply the shape of the supply and demand curve. And so no matter who is collecting the tax, the interaction of the curves, because they are the same curves, is going to get you in the same place. So what we see is the seller is paying 20 cents of the tax, and the buyers are paying $3.40 minus the 3. They're paying 40 cents of the tax, no matter who is doing the collecting.